The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, or whatever time zone you may be in. I want to welcome you to I believe this is our third session now for the Performance Palooza today, so we appreciate everybody joining us today here at the Past Performance Virtual Chapter. Just a little bit about the chapter. You guys have probably heard most of this today. If you're attending all the sessions, I hope you're taking advantage of that. My name is Ryan Adams. I'm the president of the chapter. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Ryan J. Adams on Twitter if you like. The chapter's on Twitter as well, so take advantage of that today. We've got SQLPass_PVC as our Twitter handle. If you want to talk about the Palooza today, you can use our Past PVC hashtag. We're also using just SQL Palooza as a hashtag as well. Of course, we've got our website at performance.sqlpass.org. So as we go through all the sessions today, you do need to sign up for every one of those individually, so you can go register for all of those there right off of our website. You can catch all of our monthly meetings there as well. We do have a discussion list. It's hosted with Google Groups, and it's an open list. If you join us on the website or the discussion list, we do send meeting announcements out to both of those lists, so you'll get it either way there. And then, of course, if you want to shoot an email to performance@sqlpass.org, that'll go to all of the leaders of the chapter, and we will be happy to help you out with anything that we can. So we're using GoToWebinar today. If you do need some technical assistance, you can use the raise your hand button. You'll notice that it will slide after we've started and you've been in here for a minute. You'll notice that the control panel will actually slide and shrink over to the right-hand side. If you can't see everything, all the options aren't there, you can click the red arrow at the top and expand that guy back out. You can also zoom in as well if you need to inside of the actual presentation window. You can change that zoom level there as well. If you have any specific questions for the speaker or for us here at the virtual chapter as we're going through the session today, there is a question pane there. Feel free to type your question in there and we'll get to those as we can. Anything we don't have time for, we will send those off to the presenter, and Andy can blog about those or whatever he would like to do after the fact. That way we can get some answers back to you guys. One of the most common questions we get is there a dial-in number? There is not a dial-in number. It is audio only available through your computer speakers, so it is VoIP integrated into GoToWebinar. We want to make sure that we give a huge shout out to SolarWinds. SolarWinds is our sole sponsor for this chapter that makes everything happen for us. So if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to bring these meetings to you month after month for free, much less 8 of them back to back today. So we want to thank them. They were so gracious in sponsoring us that we even had enough money to give away a $50 Amazon gift card to a random attendee out of every session hosted today. So thanks to SolarWinds for that. Past Summit. If you want the absolute best training possible, go to the Past Summit. This is fantastic. And let me tell you, if you're looking at multiple conferences, one of the things that sets this conference apart is, with the exception of full-day pre-cons, all of the regular sessions are because the guys that are speaking absolutely love this stuff and do it every day for a living. They do not get paid to host a regular session at the Past Summit. Most other conferences, these folks are getting paid for that. These guys are absolute experts. They do it because they love it and have a passion for it. I promise you it is a different experience than you've ever experienced at any other conference anywhere around the world. Take advantage of this. There is a price jump right now. It's $2,195. You'll see on the bottom right hand of the slide there. For joining us today, being a member of our chapter, we can save you $150 off of that by using our discount code down there at the bottom. You can write that down. If you don't have enough time to write that down, if you hit our website, performance.sqlpass.org, it's right there on the homepage of our website, so you won't miss that at all. You can go look that up to make sure you take advantage of using that code. So we are in session number 3. We've got Andy speaking to us today about how to do a performance health check. Again, our website address is down there at the bottom, so if you want to attend the other sessions, you can go out there and find the links and register for each of those individually. The system will send you an email with a link that is specific to you for that session. So with that, I'm going to hand it over, and we'll change this over to Andy to be the presenter. I'll let him introduce himself and Let's see here. Okay, I believe I changed it over to you.
Do you see my PowerPoint up in the window?
I do not.
Okay. I was going to say, I don't see it in the presentation
Okay.
viewer, so.
All right, hang on.
I think you tried to make me the presenter.
Yeah, let's hang on.
Okay, here we go. Made the presenter. Is that better?
There we go.
Okay.
Great, thank you, Andy.
Yep. Well, as Ryan mentioned, I'm Andy Galbraith. I work for a remote services company called Entirety. We're part of a larger hosting company hosting out of Colorado. I am the team lead on our remote DBA services team, and I'm on Twitter at DBA_Andy. The 30-second spiel about us: we perform remote administration as a service. We help companies that don't have a DBA. They're small, they don't need a DBA, but we also work with large companies that just need an additional bit of help. So we work for SQL Server and Oracle. Most of our work tends to be SQL Server these days. I blog at nebraskasql.blogspot.com. Bonus points for all of you who know where Nebraska even is. I've been doing this for almost 16 years now as a company DBA and as a remote services provider. I've been a remote provider now for 3 years with 2 different companies. So, must have got my slide out of order. There we go. Ryan already touched on attending PASS. I can't say much more than what he said other than to say definitely. There is nothing you will do better for your professional development, whether it's education or networking, than coming to the annual summit. There's some really good training out there that you can pay for, but there's nothing that matches the summit. And I've got the registration code up that Ryan mentioned earlier. So, is your SQL Server healthy? And I would guess that most of you are sitting out there saying, sure it is. Nobody's calling me, nobody's knocking down my door, so I must be okay, right? Right? So a health check is a way to make sure that you're okay, or at least as close as you can to make sure. Remember, always, it depends, but a health check lets you try to stay in front of it. It needs to be a proactive thing that you do before something goes wrong. You want to find out problems before somebody beats on your door. You want to handle as much of the environment as possible. I know as a remote provider, I run into a lot of DBAs at companies that concentrate on their SQL Server. And I ask them, well, what's the page life expectancy for your box right now? What's page life expectancy? What's the operating system in perf mod? Oh, we don't know anything about Windows. We just talk to the server people for that. The next layer of that, and it's become more and more important over the last 5 to 10 years, is your VMware environment. Odds are almost everybody sitting on this call, the hundreds of people listening to this right now, all of you deal with VMware or Hyper-V somewhere in your world. And hopefully you know about it if you do. I run into that every now and then too. Well, something's wrong with my server. Well, is it a VM or physical? Well, I don't know. Well, you're on a VM, and that VM's been vMotioned to a host that's very under-resourced and over-allocated, and that's why everything's gone to heck. So you need to know if your machines are VMs, but you also need to know information about VMs. You don't need to be a VMware admin. You don't need to be a VMware certified professional VCP, but you need to know enough to know how it interacts with your SQL Server. The same thing is true for storage and networking. Odds are if you work at a company of any size, you have a SAN engineer, you have a network engineer, maybe a team of engineers, but you still need to be aware of how storage and networking impact your world. The best thing you can do is have a good relationship with those people. It's kind of funny, one of the first large companies I worked for, a bank here in Omaha, and we had a team of DBAs, a team of server people, 2 SAN people, a team of networking people, And every day I ate lunch with the server team and the stand guys, and nobody understood why I wasn't going to lunch with the other DBAs. It's like, well, we need to share a little information among the DBAs, and I work on my stuff and you work on your stuff. But what the SAN guy is doing every day has a lot more impact on me than what you're doing on your SQL server. And then it needs to be recurring. If you don't do a health check on a regular basis, you're never going to know when your systems are degrading, when you need additional help. Just because everything was fine last October doesn't mean everything is fine now in July of 2015. With us, when we do our health checks for our clients, we do quarterly health checks on kind of a sliding quarter. It's not like everything gets checked every January and every April. It's sliding over a quarter. And then we compare that information from quarter to quarter to see if we see trends, to see where things are going wrong, or sometimes even to see where there's too many resources. You have a box and it's got 8 CPUs in it and you never get over 10% CPU. Well, maybe you don't need 8 CPUs anymore. Of course, then you need to be aware that at the end of the year when you run your reports and you need 8 CPUs, you got to stop and think about that too. So I've already touched on this a little bit. What do I need to check? What are the things that are important enough that we need to document, that we need to trend from period to period? You look at Windows, the service pack, the drives, the disk, the latency, your offsets, your antivirus, CPU, NUMA nodes, RAM, perfmon, Windows power plan. Did I lose anybody? Do you keep track of all of these things for your system, or at least look at them on a regular basis? I mean, we all know that we should have run books of everything, but I also know a lot of DBAs don't. But do you at least pay attention to these things? When your server admins sneak in on you on the weekend and perform a Windows service pack that now has a new problem for SQL Server, are you aware before or after it happens? And this is just dealing with the operating system and a little bit of infrastructure stuff. Then you have to deal with SQL Server and the version and the pack and the layout and the memory and lock pages, page life expectancy, buffer cache. I'm going to stop talking because there's too many things coming up. All of these things on the screen are relevant to how your machine performs and if you're going to have problems. Do you track all these things? Do you baseline them for future comparison so that you can see that your page life expectancy was doing this 3 months ago and now it's doing this? Or even something as simple as the recovery model. Do you keep track of the recovery model on all your systems? Do you know that if you're running simple recovery model, you can't have point-in-time recovery? Those little things that matter for SLAs and whether people wake you up at 2 in the morning. All of the things on the screen matter. I was looking for a picture for this slide, and this one came up pretty quickly. I like it a lot. What do you do for all of those things? And we'll talk about a few tools that we can use. If you're not aware of who Glenn Berry is, you should be. Glenn is out of Colorado, and he's spent years documenting the dynamic management views, intelligent ways to join them together to pull back data that you can get sometimes some other ways through Activity Monitor or other basic tools. But it's a programmatic way to pull the data, and being programmatic makes it easier to store it for later use. Glenn currently works for Paul Randall and Kimberly Tripp at SQL Skills. He's been there for, I want to say, 2 years now. And they have continued to support the work that he does with the dynamic management views. You can follow him on Twitter. He's around most of the time at Glenn Allen Berry. Other queries. I'll show you here in a little bit the notepad that I use for a lot of the queries that I run day to day, both proactive queries and things that I do reactively. And if you don't have something like that, whether it's a SQL pad, a notepad, a Word document full of all the queries that you touch from time to time, you'll find that it makes your life a lot easier if you start having one. WMI, Windows Management Instrumentation. This is something that a lot of people who aren't operating system people, aren't infrastructure people, look at me and say, what is that? WMI is a way to reach under the hood in your Windows server and pull back a lot of useful information about the server. And we'll do some demonstrations on that as we move forward. And then Virtual Center. Virtual Center, if you're not aware, is a command center controller for VMware. And there may be I assume there is a companion for Hyper-V, but I don't know what it is. The joyous part of vCenter is that it is a GUI interface and a web interface, but it all sits on top of a SQL Server database. Anything that runs on a SQL Server database can be useful to you as a DBA. And there are some documented queries to pull information out of vCenter, although the best case scenario is if you can actually get access into vCenter. There's a couple of blog posts out there that I need to add to the documents at the end of this slide telling you how you should interact with your VM admin to get you read-only access to vCenter. It is a lot easier than using the queries that we'll talk about, but understandably, there are times that the VM admins and the infrastructure admins don't think you should have that kind of information, even if it is only read-only. So Glen scripts. They are versioned by SQL version, but they are created into one giant script per version. Glen does a decent job updating them every 3 or 4 months for mistakes that people find, new feature adds, changes to the DMVs that happen version by version. Everything it runs through T-SQL. There is no PowerShell or extended events calls or anything like that. There's no WMI and Glen scripts. But there's still a fair amount of basic operating system information you can pull directly out of SQL Server. So let's pull out here, if I can get out of my PowerPoint. There we go. So I am inside the most recent version of the SQL 2014 diagnostic script because I've got a 2014 instance I'm going to play with here. And there are versions of the scripts all the way back to 2015. This most recent one was just recently updated. Let's see if Firefox will play nice with us here. Go to, and I have this link later in the slide deck as well. But we will go out to SQL Skills, Glenberry, and you can slide down through his scripts, through his blog to find it, but there's also a category for DMV queries in his blog. And as you can see, they've been updated in July, June, May. And you can see that there are versions, even for the most recent 2016 CTP that's out there, 2014, 12, all the way back to 2005. And why isn't there one for SQL 2000? Well, there weren't any DMVs in SQL 2000. And you'll find if you're interacting with a SQL Server 2000, I know they're all out there, we deal with plenty of them too, that an awful lot of the time you have to black magic fake it to learn most of the things you can get. Snap your fingers out of a DMV. So all of you still running SQL Server 2000, I can't help you a whole lot there other than to show you some of the information we're going to pull back in this health check to give you a clue of things you need to look for. I'm not going to be able to show you where to find them in SQL 2000. That would be a much more painful presentation. So we're going to roll down through the 2014 script. Something as simple as check your major project version. You have the correct version of his script. Glenn does a fair job of keeping the build numbers here in the script so that you can see when you return your @@ that I'm at 12.0.2269, which means I'm between RTM and CU1. When was the SQL Server installed? All the various properties, agent jobs and categories. I'm sure you all document this, right? All of the jobs that are on your system and when they run, and do they notify people, and what categories are they? Alert information. As you can see, I'm a bad boy on my test instance. I don't have any of the relevant alerts set up, any of the relevant IO alerts 17 through 25 or 822, 823 through 824. Here we were talking about Windows information a little earlier. I'm running 6.1 Service Pack 1 with primary English 1033. Service information, NUMA nodes, which here on my laptop is not exciting. Four logical CPUs and one physical CPU with 8 GB of RAM. How can you tell that the other way? You can look at the properties of the instance, but that doesn't help you dump it out into a table to store for later use. That doesn't help you reference it to other queries by joining them together. This one is interesting to me because it's yet another way to see whether your machine is a VM or not. I'll show you a couple of WMI queries as we get into WMI that do the same thing, but it's always interesting to find another way to see whether your machine is a VM. Not because being a VM is a bad thing. When I've given this talk before, people ask, well, do you not like VMs because you keep talking about that? It's like, no. VMs are amazing, and there's a great majority of the machines in the world that could be virtualized without any problem. But it changes how you look at your machine, how you proactively plan for how your machines need to work, and for how you react when things go wrong. There's things that are relevant to physical machines that don't matter at all on VMs. Even more so, there are things that happen with VMs, like vMotions and overallocations, that aren't relevant to physical machines at all. Processor information, failover cluster information. Let's get down to something a little more interesting. File names and paths for everything. So I've got all my databases here on my junk instance on my laptop. The files are all in the C drive. Don't do this at home, kids. Their sizes, their growth increments. Volume information, IO warnings, drive latency. And this is code from Jimmy May. I want to say he was at Microsoft at the time, but I couldn't swear to that. That Glenn has permission to include, and we'll come across a few more of those types of queries as we go down to show you the drive latency. And as there's the note in the query, latency over 20 to 25 milliseconds is usually a problem. And you can see what the disk is like here on my little laptop. I don't run an SSD like a lot of the people do. If I had that come up on a health check, I would say, talk to your disk admin before you do anything else. Average stall information, recovery model on your databases. Missing indexes are always fun. And as you can see, I don't really have anything that important on here. I would say the biggest advantage I've ever seen is over 150 million. The advantage is a calculated value for seeks versus cost versus the impact to the user pulled out of the missing index DMVs. Whenever you talk about missing index DMVs, rightfully so, people say, don't just put them out there. You got to stop and think about it. When I see missing indexes of hundreds of thousands of advantage, I look pretty hard at putting them out there if I can, with the one exception of making sure that there aren't any duplicative entries, because that's one thing that queries like this are really bad about. If you need an index on first name, last name, phone number on a table, it's quite possible you'll see multiple rows come back in this query saying that first name is a really good index. First name, last name is a really good index. First name, last name, phone is an okay index. Well, so there's still some judgment analysis involved when you do things like this. Virtual log files, and this is adapted from Michelle. She's SQL Fool on Twitter. This is something else that until I went to some SQL skills training years ago, I had never really understood how they worked or what it was about. But you can see that in my DBA database, I have 84 virtual log files. In my case, everything is under 200, that's happy. There's times that I run this query and get back databases that have VLFs with thousands of virtual log files. In and of itself, it's not a guaranteed problem, but it usually is. Do you know what VLFs are before I started talking about them? They're individual units inside the log file. They're logical units inside the log file. Do you keep track of this information? You should be. CPU use by database, I/O, buffer pool, weights. Weights are a fun piece of work because they're relevant to everybody all the time. You can see that the top weight on my system, my little laptop here, is backup I/O. That can be a problem. It might not be a problem. It matters what kind of delays you're experiencing. All kinds of operating system weights, I/O completion weights. The catch with weight stats is kind of like page life expectancy that we'll get to in a little bit. It is a point-in-time thing and is not terribly useful for trending when you just look at it once every 3 months. It's something that you need to watch a little more frequently than that. Signal weights related to CPU load, average task count, CPU load, utilization history, worker times, a whole stack of CPU relevant queries if you're seeing CPU pressure on your box. Page life expectancy, the amount of time that a page would expect to stay in the buffer once it gets loaded before it gets flushed out by something else needing to push it out in, first out style. So my page life expectancy at this split second on my laptop is 90,000 seconds. So I think I'm doing okay for the moment on my laptop that's not doing anything other than hosting the query I'm running for you. But page life expectancy is, again, a value that changes every single second as your server is doing work. The best way to track page life expectancy is not with this query on an ongoing basis, but by having a regular perfmon collector running on your SQL server, so that every 5 minutes or even every 1 minute, it's storing this value, and then you can look at it over the course of the day and watch as your page life expectancy goes up all day long until 8 p.m. when some large data load or reindexing job or something like that happens, and suddenly it tanks down to 50 for an hour and a half before it starts its slow climb back up out of the basement again. The fact that it's that much of a tank for that hour and a half is the reason your data load is slow, or at least one of the primary reasons your data load might be slow. We'll get down here to line 867, and you see that it crosses to database-specific queries. So you can run these for each database on your system to get the file sizes for that database, the I/O for that database. A lot of this is very similar to the instance-wide information, but it provides you relevant to this database so that rather than getting the top 25 stored procedures for the whole server, I get them just in this database, so that if I know something is wrong with the widget database and I run the instance-wide one and find out that all the top ones on the instance are for the Bob database. Well, I don't care about the Bob database right now. I'm having problems with the widget database, and I want a query that lets me see just that. Input, output, bad indexes. This is the flip side to missing indexes, and it's a different type of problem. It's something I see less frequently, but still quite often with machines. My data load is slow, or my data purge is slow. We go out and we run a query like this, and we find out that there are 15 indexes on the transaction table, but none of them are ever used for anything. But when you're writing to the transaction table, inserting or deleting, you've got to update all 15 indexes every time something goes by. Or maybe it's a case where you have an index that's used every month for your month-end report, but it's not used for the 29 and a half days other than that. You may want to consider dropping it, creating it for the load, dropping it again at the end, so that every month you just add it for that 6 hours that the load runs. This will show you that by showing you the reads and writes. Let's see if I have a database that has some bad indexes in it. I probably don't. Come on, Kimberly. Nope. Okay. But it'll show you the total reads, the total writes, and the difference. Indexes with a lot of writes and not very many reads may not be useful. Here's missing indexes for just your database. It's similar to the previous query, but filtered for this database. So you can see it goes on and on and on. Frequently modified database, fragmentation info, most of your major intelligent reindexing utilities, Ola Hallengrens, Michelle Efforts, use some variant of a query like this to pull the information out of index physical stats to see whether your index is fragmented enough that it needs to be rebuilt. Read writes for all indexes. If you have in-memory OLTP tables, there's information about the indexes there. So 1,336 lines later, we have all of this information that you can pull. The number one thing you don't want to do when you download Glenn's script is execute it. I had a really funny experience with a junior DBA a couple of years ago where they pulled down the script because I told them to, and then they execute. And 3 minutes later, it was still spinning and returned so many result sets that their machine had completely frozen up. It's like, run it bit by bit as you want to look at it. Even if there are groups of things you want to run together, that's fine. But you don't want to run 1,300 lines of code that has 50-some queries in it all at once. I would normally pause for questions now, but that doesn't help us. So
Actually, I can help you with that.
Go ahead.
Because we do have a
Go
few.
ahead.
So one question is, what number should PLE be over?
PLE, that is a question that could rip up Twitter and the blogosphere for a long time.
Yes, it would.
An old number for PLE is 300. You want to be over 300 95 to 99% of the time. As time has progressed, that has been updated because we all have so much more memory and so many more CPU than we used to. I usually try to watch a trend more than a hard number. That's why I was talking about perfmon collectors earlier, and you can watch your PLE rise and tank. I still like to see your PLE above 1,000 most of the time, but that's a style thing more than a hard guideline that I can open a book and say, here, Microsoft Bob says do this. So watch the trend. Use perfmon and watch the trend.
When you give us the downloads, the presentation, can you include it? Will you include the scripts as well, or no?
Yes, I will include the current version of Glenn's script plus the other couple of scripts that I'll show you as we move forward.
Excellent. Let's see. How do we know if VMware is not allocating the requested memory or CPU by SQL Server?
You don't have a hard way to see that inside SQL Server. You can see a little bit of it from the vCenter queries that we'll talk about a little bit later. I mean, on the face of it, you can see whether you're getting the true allocation you requested. If you request a machine that has 8 vCPUs and 16 gig of RAM, you can see from Windows and SQL Server whether you got 8 CPUs and 16 gig of RAM. What you can't see is that it's on a host that has 128 CPUs and 128 gig of RAM, but already has 200 CPUs allocated to other machines. There's a little bit of that you're going to be able to see from the host queries in VMware, but you can't directly see it from SQL Server or Windows.
Last one I'll ask you for now, we'll save some more toward the end, is how can I control the VLF count?
The best way to control your VLF count is to set your log file at the size that it needs to be. Always, always, always leave auto grow on, just in case something happens and it needs it. You don't want your log file to fill up unnecessarily because you happen to be running a bigger load than usual today. But if your log file on your 200 gig database is 50 gig most of the time, then build a database with it at 50 gig and leave it alone. Don't shrink it down to 12 gig because it's almost empty right now, and then let it grow back up to 50 gig tomorrow, because every time it shrinks and auto grows and shrinks and auto grows, it's thrashing up that log file and adding more units over and over again. So the best thing you can do, get a good call on what size the file needs to be, and obviously for a new database, a lot of times that's hard. Even if you know how large the data piece of the new database is going to be, because the vendor swears you only are loading 200 gig in, it's hard to estimate the log file. But get a good handle on it, set it there, be happy.
I might add to that Kim Tripp has an amazing blog post. I swear I've read that blog post more than any other post I've ever read in my entire life. But it's also, she works for SQL Skills as well. It's called How Many VLFs, Too Many or Too Few? Man, you got to, everybody needs to go bookmark that thing.
Yeah, and then also the 8 steps to transaction log throughput or maintenance. I forget what the last word is, but it contains a lot of that similar information about how the log works and touches on VLFs as well.
Yes. All right, I'll let you continue on with that.
Okay. So there's lots of things that are touched on in Glenn's scripts, but I use either slightly modified versions of those queries myself. And this is the notepad I was talking about before. I just keep a notepad of queries that I find. I try to keep track of where they come from if I can, that I've modified them or not modified them. One thing to be aware of when you are playing with other people's work, and this is just true all the time, if you blog, if you tweet, if you Facebook, any other way that you might communicate with people, always make sure to cite whoever your original work is from. It's wonderful to find amazing stuff online. It never ceases to amaze me 15 years later, all the free stuff that people put out there. But when you find a piece of work from somebody else and you say, hey, I'm using this to solve my problem, say that it came from Glenn Berry or Paul Randall or whoever else, Brent Ozar. And I'll show you a little bit of that. Let's just go ahead and do it right now. So we'll come into queries. And as I was just saying, I keep notes in it because every now and then I share a copy of this file with a coworker or something like that. Job history out of an MS SQL tip. Gives you basic information on when a wide variety of jobs run. As you can see, the statistics update job on my little laptop takes a long time to run. Databases that aren't owned by SA, jobs that aren't owned by SA, simple database recovery. These are just little modifications from other things that I use for myself when I'm checking machines. I love this query. I use it all the time, and I wish I knew where it came from. It's a great roll-up query that shows you all of the different types of backups that could be happening on your machine and when they were last run. So I have my demo corruption databases offline. It's never been backed up. But this copy of AdventureWorks_2 is online and it's never been backed up, and that's not a good thing. My model database is in full recovery, so the log is recoverable, but I'm not backing it up. That's something else that you'll find on an awful lot of your systems. If you have model in full, odds are you're not backing up its log, because so many of the canned things, including Ola Hellengren's script, back up the logs of your user databases. Usually that's not going to matter. I mean, you don't do a lot of traffic in your model database, obviously, but it can. And then you can see that my job last ran at about 10 o'clock this morning, because you can watch that the full backups just trickled straight down the line here. This is a useful proactive tool, but it's also a useful reactive tool when you need to fix something or need to find something. I like queries like this one because they do all these ugly joins between all the different tables without me having to remember which one joins to which one on what field. I can join the backup set to the media family, to the media set, to the backup file, to the file group. And this one just pulls back a generic, last 50. But once I have that query of all of those joins, then I can do whatever I want with the result set. The same thing is true with Glenn's queries for a lot of them. You can look at it, run at it, and say, oh, I need to add this field and exclude that field. He's done all the hard work of joining all the DMVs together for you. You just mess with what information you want. Subscriber databases, a script to rename the instance, jobs and schedules. Different variant on a backup query that shows you how old backups are. This is useful for a different type of checking, how old your backups are programmatically as opposed to just dealing with the dates. The date query is more useful when you just want to manually run a query. These numbers are more useful if you want to incorporate this into something programmatic. Here's something that I modified from Michelle again, how to pull information relevant to backups from maintenance plans. And I want to say I'm not going to have any on this machine. Yeah, but it pulls back the maintenance plan, the sub plan, the databases, the backups that are done. It's a little more relevant if you're dealing with maintenance plans specifically than just pulling the backup information straight out of that backup join that I showed you a little bit ago. I never thought I would use this query as much as I do. I've never done that. I had never done that much with the default trace until 2 or 3 years ago. I knew it was out there, but I never really messed with it. And I came into a situation where I had to find out, why a file had blown up. And I tripped over this from Tibor Karazi, and it shows me that my tempdb file auto grew these 3 times, these 4 times if I could count, the log file 3 times and the data file 4 times. And I think if I remove the filter on tempdb, I'm going to get the same 4 rows. I don't know why any of my other databases would have grown. Oh, there we go, master and model growing out as well. The limitation here is that you are hampered by the default trace's size. It only rolls back a certain amount of time before the information writes over it again, first in, first out. So as you can see, even though my query pulls all the way back till May of 2014, you can see that I'm only getting information from the last couple of days because my default trace is overwritten. Top cached plans that consume CPU. This could be interesting on the laptop. You can see a plan was created at 10:02 this morning. It's been executed 6 times and has used this much total CPU. And on my little laptop, that's the most CPU, the top 50 queries. And what is that query? I'm pulling a certificate and log in from database principal certificates. So you can see that it's a under the cover logins query. The relevance to this is that you can then take that plan handle, put it into this free proc cache call, and selectively eliminate a bad query plan from your cache. This is another one of those things that I found and haven't been able to find again to document where I got it. But you can snipe out bad query plans. And again, it's useful proactively and reactively. If you are tracking this information over time, when you come back and review the health check, you can deal with it. Similarly, if something's going south and you get woke up at 2 in the morning, you can run a query like this and deal with it. Modify database owners, okay. The other piece is this failed job listing script. Again, it's modified from a SQL tip. And you can see that my online status check job is enabled and it's failed 33 times in 2 weeks because I keep taking my databases on and offline, so it's not happy. My backup check has failed 5 times because I have those databases that aren't being backed up like you saw in the backup query. Again, these are little things that once you find them, keep them. Because yes, you can Google for them and find them, but it's better to keep copies yourself in case Google's not there. And you never know when you're going to be working on a server when Google's not there. WMI. We go all the way to the beginning. I hate when I do that. I'm just going to bail out. We'll start from here. So WMIC is the command tool to interact with WMI, Windows Management Information, I mentioned earlier. And it is, general syntax is noun, verb, properties. So I can say WMIC, I want to know about the CPU, get me the name, cores, and processors. WMIC for the computer system, I want to get the model and the manufacturer. And here's a link to a TechNet blog that includes a whole stack of these useful queries. And as you can see, for the first query, I got back that I have 4 Xeon E5 CPUs, each with 1 core and 1 logical proc. What about this machine? It's a VMware running the VMware virtual platform. That's another way, as I mentioned earlier, to see that you're running a VM. And I have to say, when I sit down in a machine, this is the one that I default to. It's the thing that pops to my head, is WMIC computer system. Another way to tell is with the NIC. VMware has a couple of different VM Ethernet adapters. The most common is this VMX Net3. So if there's a VMX Net3 NIC in your machine, you're dealing with a VM. And you can see the same thing from computer management as I show you here. Okay, good. I do have the link to David in here. If you deal with VMs, you should be reading davidklee.net. He is one of the 3 or 4 SQL Server professionals who has their hands completely through VMware. Denny Cherry does a good job. Brent Ozar does a good job. I'm sure I'm forgetting somebody else. But David is more about VMs than anybody else. I used to work with him a couple of jobs ago, and now he's out by himself consulting. But if you're having trouble with SQL Server on a VM, this should be your first out. And he wrote a great article about why DBAs need access to vCenter and how to convince your VM admins to let you in. I mentioned this earlier. This is a common thought, almost a joke inside the VMware community. You go Google this, you'll find all kinds of memes like this. Every time you directly query the VCDB, there are VMware admins all around the world that get a shiver down their back and don't know why, because you are violating the system. And as DBAs, we all kind of know how that works. I mean, you're not supposed to be querying application data as the DBA unless you are troubleshooting a specific problem, right? You don't go wandering around inside user databases just to see what information is there. And this blog from someone at VMware talks a little bit more about that from the VMware VM admin point of view. I prefer this point of view from Jonathan at SQL Skills and a few other people out there that say, we need this information and it's right there. Why shouldn't we be using it? This blog from Jonathan has some great queries in it. We'll show you a couple of them. Even though the font is horrible, I'm not going to bother zooming in to show you this query. But it shows you the % ready time values when you run this query. And you can see that on this particular result set, at these sample times from 8:45, that's not sorted properly, but you can see the time in these various time slots, 8:45, 7 o'clock, 8:55, CPU ready time was in red. What does that mean? It means that your CPUs are waiting too long for a CPU on the host. Your VMware CPU wants to do something, but because the host is busy, it's sitting there waiting. Hey, can I have a physical CPU yet? Hey, can I have a physical CPU yet? Hey, can I have a physical CPU? Oh, thank you, gracious VM host. Those are times that don't show up as anything meaningful to you when you are just looking at SQL Server DMVs, or if you are just looking in Windows or perfmon. All those show up as is CPU slag time. My CPU is really slow. Why is that? This is something to watch. Host information about your host. The first host is a ProLiant with E5 CPUs. It's got 2 of them, 8 cores at this hertz for 16 threads. You can see here these meaningful things we talked about before. Core overcommit, 1.75. Well, because I have 14 cores, hopefully you can see here in the very beginning, but there's only 8 cores in the machine. I'm only at 0.75 threads because there's 16 threads with hyperthreading, but still I have 14 cores against my 8-core box. Memory, my host has roughly 71 gig in VMs, and it only has 73 gig in the host. Your host is still running the VMware operating system, for lack of a different term, but it also has 97% of its memory allocated to VMs. So that could well be a problem. If we slide down here about halfway down, you can see one that has an overcommit ratio of 1 because it has 4960 compared to 4949. That doesn't necessarily equate to a performance problem, and we need to stop and talk about that. Just because your host is completely or even over-allocated, like we're looking at these cores, the 1.75 cores, doesn't mean you're going to have a problem, but it means you could have a problem. If all of those VMs want all of their CPU because they're all at 80 or 90% CPU at once, this will become a problem. If everybody wants to use their 24 or 32 gigs of RAM all at once, this will be a problem. VMware is built on the fact that that's just hardly ever true, especially if you're dealing with non-database, non-email servers. Most servers are CPU slow or CPU light all the time. They're memory light all the time. So you can do this. You can have 1.75 cores because nobody's using more than 20% of their core anyway. Memory ballooning. This comes back to what I was talking about a little bit ago with the memory that VMware requires. If VMware needs memory, it can take it back from the hosts in a violent fashion, and that's called ballooning. So you can see in this that in this first set, it spent 390 minutes ballooned out of 300 minutes, which doesn't make any sense. But you can see there's all this time that this particular VM was ballooned because its host needed to take information away from, or take memory away from it. Here's a similar query for weekly ballooning. And then there's other information. All of that came out of the link from Jonathan that I had earlier in the email. And for things like that, I do not have a file downloaded to provide you as part of the information, but the links are valid in the PDF of the slide deck that'll be out there. Brian O'Dwyer through SQL Tips has a similar but different group of queries out at this SQL Tips link. Here's one of his for guest configuration. You can see that if you don't know, in the world of VMware, an actual VM is a guest because it is the guest on the host. So each one of these result lines is a or it has 1 gig of RAM, 2 CPUs, was booted on this date, currently on, doesn't have any reservations for memory or CPU, has an old version of VMware tools, so on and so forth. Guest disk information. You can see that for this machine, the C drive is 59 gig and 11 free. The D drive is 24 gig and 11 free. Yes, it's a coincidence that almost every drive has 11 free. So I am dangerously close to running over here. We're just going to push through these last few slides before I go back to Ryan. We've already talked about baselining. Save that data. Compare it. If you run checks every month, compare it month to month. And don't just compare to last month. Compare to every month over at least the last 13 months so that you get a point in time, or so you don't have just a point in time. Because every April you close your year end and things go to heck and they're really busy. Well, comparing April to May to June to July doesn't help you. You need to compare all the way back to last April when it was end of year and everything went to heck to see if what's better or worse. Proactive repairs, checking for resource and best practices problems. Resource planning, find out machines that are short, but also machines that are too much. When you do an upgrade of Server 1, Server 1 might not need as many resources as they gave it 5 years ago because Server 1 doesn't do anything now, or because Server 1 was over-allocated 5 years ago. And then more baselining. Glenn's diagnostic data, on that same link where you download it, you can also download spreadsheets. I won't open it up to show you, but it's a blank set of spreadsheets set for each query, so you can just copy paste it out of Management Studio into those spreadsheets to store it. Store it in some kind of a repository, create your own database. Include some kind of a collection stamp so that you pull back that this is the CPU percent now. Automate it if you can. I've been playing with a script, but I don't have it anywhere close to ready yet to run those diagnostic queries and dump them out into tables so that you can then compare programmatically. SQL diag command was something that somebody threw out at me the last time I gave this presentation, so I put a link into it. It's a group of utilities that were created to run Glenberry scripts and dump that information out. Other than a glance at his webpage, I haven't done anything with it, but I included a reference here. Use at your own risk. Glenn's information, the WMI queries, David's vCenter access blog, Jonathan and Brian's VCDB queries. If you need sample databases of some size to play with, download them from SQL Skills at this link. They have free databases of credit reporting information and also great databases that are corruptions built into them. If you need to play with CheckDB for repairs, fixes, finding things, you can download the corrupt databases that Paul Randall uses in his demonstrations to play with them yourself. There's also a great blog post from Paul about how to set up your SSMS for making the font sizes larger and the color sizes larger, and Ryan playing with it after I got off with you earlier. I figured out how to change a couple of those things. I don't know if you noticed that or not.
Nice.
So now we're at the end of the world, but we're also at 2 o'clock. So Ryan, I don't know what kind of opening you have here for me.
Yeah, so we don't have much of an opening, although if you could go back to your very first slide just to show that where you've got all your contact information.
Yep.
Just so everybody can see that, so they've got that. So I will remind everybody that we will make available on our website, performance.sqlpass.org, that's where everything's hosted, and the video through the YouTube channel that we have, but the link will be on our website, both Andy's scripts and his slide deck and the recording. So all three of those will be made available. Give us about a week to get that posted, and we'll get all that up. Then what I'm going to do is because we don't have time to go through all these questions, I'm going to ask Andy to answer just a couple of them. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to send all of them to him. That way if he wants, since he blogs, he can blog the answers to those questions, and you guys will make sure that you guys get a link to that as well. So let me just pick a couple here at random. Let's see. Are there any articles or anything you can suggest as best practices on auto growth settings?
I don't have an article to throw at you. There's some interesting reading out there in that transaction log stuff that we were talking about from Kimberly Tripp before. The guideline that I recommend, that our company recommends, is to always use fixed increments, don't use percentages. As your database gets large, those percentages get very large. 10% of a 200 gig file is a large auto grow, and your machine, your database gets slagged for the amount of time that it takes that growth to happen. So set your auto growth in relatively small fixed increments depending on the size of the file. I like 128 or 256 meg, sometimes up to a gig. You have to allow for the fact, like I said, that your machine is going to kind of slow down, your database is going to slow down for the amount of time that auto growth happens. Even if you're in zero initialization, you still have that problem. but always use fixed increments.
All right, I actually have one that I'm going to answer myself just because.
Go for it.
I've always referred to WMI as like Microsoft's hidden little gem, and so he asked, why use WMIC now that we have PowerShell as a best approach? And the answer to that is that yes, PowerShell can use WMI, but it's just another way to use WMI.
Right. You're still interfacing with WMI under the hood.
Yeah, it just depends on how you want to interface with it. And there's actually there actually are WMI tools out there if you want to go through WMI in a graphical environment. Microsoft does provide some free WMI tools out there. So with that,
in my experience, I'm starting to become a PowerShell guy, but there's a lot to learning PowerShell, whereas playing with WMIC is as simple as reading that blog post I showed you.
Yes, yes. So with that, Andy, thank you very much for speaking for us today and taking time out of your day to come out here and speak for all of us. We really appreciate it. I know everybody's ready to jump over to the next session, so we will see everybody over there. But Andy, thanks again. We appreciate it.
Thank you much.